Hey there, and welcome to True Scary Stories. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That helps YouTube know you love creepy stories, and it'll keep sending more your way.
8 True Roommate Horror Stories. Story 1. The Night Walker. I thought I was getting the perfect roommate when Sarah answered my Craigslist ad. She was quiet, clean, and always paid her rent on time. For the first 3 months, everything seemed normal. She worked as a nurse at the local hospital and kept to herself mostly. I barely saw her, except for occasional hellos in the hallway. That changed one night in October, when I woke up around 2 a.m. to use the bathroom. As I stepped into the hallway, I froze. Sarah was standing at the end of the corridor, completely still, facing the wall. She was wearing her white nightgown, and her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders. I called her name softly, thinking maybe she was sleepwalking, but she didn't respond. I approached her carefully and gently touched her shoulder. She turned around slowly, and what I saw still haunts me. Her eyes were wide open, but completely vacant, like she was looking through me rather than at me. She smiled this weird, empty smile, and walked past me, back to her room without saying a word. The next morning, I asked her about it. She laughed it off, and said she sometimes had trouble sleeping, due to her work schedule. She claimed she didn't remember anything about standing in the hallway. I wanted to believe her, but something felt off about the way she avoided eye contact when she said it. Over the next few weeks, the incidents became more frequent. I'd wake up to find her standing in different parts of the apartment. Sometimes she'd be in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen. Other times I'd find her in the kitchen, just standing by the refrigerator, always with that same blank expression, an empty smile. I started keeping my bedroom door locked at night, but that didn't stop the creepy encounters. One night I heard soft footsteps outside my door around 3 a.m. When I looked through the peephole I had installed, Sarah was standing right outside my room. She stayed there for over an hour, occasionally trying the door handle very gently. Things escalated when I woke up one night to find my bedroom door wide open. I was sure I had locked it before going to sleep. Sarah was nowhere to be seen, but I had this overwhelming feeling that someone had been watching me sleep. I found muddy footprints leading from my room to the front door, even though it hadn't rained in days. I confronted Sarah again, but this time her reaction was different. Instead of laughing it off, she got angry and defensive. She accused me of trying to make her look crazy, and said I was probably the one sleepwalking, but I knew what I had experienced was real. The breaking point came on a Thursday night. I had been having trouble sleeping, so I decided to stay up late, watching Netflix in the living room. Around 4 a.m. I heard Sarah's bedroom door open. I muted the TV and listened. Slow, deliberate footsteps moved through the apartment. I peeked around the corner and saw her walking toward the front door. She unlocked it and stepped outside, still in her nightgown. Curious and concerned, I followed her at a distance. She walked down 3 flights of stairs and out into the parking lot. Then she just stood there, in the middle of the empty lot, facing our building, for almost an hour. The whole time she was smiling that same eerie smile. When she finally came back inside, I pretended to be asleep on the couch. She walked right past me and went to her room like nothing had happened. But as she passed, I heard her whisper something under her breath. It sounded like she was counting, but I couldn't make out the numbers. The next day, I started looking for a new place to live. I couldn't take the stress anymore, and I was genuinely scared of what Sarah might do next. But before I could find anywhere suitable, she disappeared. I came home from work one evening to find her room completely empty. All her furniture, clothes, and personal items were gone. There was no note, no explanation, nothing. She had even taken her security deposit from our landlord without telling me. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. A few days later, I ran into our downstairs neighbor, Miss Sheen. She asked me if my roommate was okay, because she had been seeing her standing in the parking lot every night for weeks, always around 4 a.m. When I told her Sarah had moved out, Mrs. Chen looked confused, but I saw her last night. She was standing right there, in that same white nightgown, smiling up at your apartment. I never saw Sarah again after that conversation, but sometimes late at night, I still hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door. And when I look through the peephole, there's never anyone there, but I can't shake the feeling that someone is standing just out of sight, watching and waiting. I moved out of that apartment 6 months later. The new tenant who took Sarah's room only lasted 3 weeks before breaking his lease. When I asked the landlord why, he said the guy complained about strange noises and claimed someone was trying to get into his room at night. The landlord thought he was just paranoid, but I knew better.
Story 2. The Collector. When I first moved in with Marcus, I thought his extensive collection of vintage cameras was pretty cool. He had dozens of them displayed on shelves throughout our shared apartment, ranging from old Polaroids to professional film cameras from the 90s. He told me he was a photography enthusiast and had been collecting them since college. Marcus seemed like a normal guy in his late 20s. He worked in IT, kept the common areas clean, and was generally pleasant to be around. The only thing that struck me as a bit odd was how protective he was of his camera collection. He made it very clear that I should never touch them, not even to dust them off. Some of these are extremely delicate and valuable, he explained during my first week there. I'd prefer if you just admire them from a distance. I respected his wishes and never thought much about it, until I started noticing some strange things. First, I realized that several of the cameras were always loaded with film, even though Marcus claimed he rarely used them anymore. When I asked about it, he said he liked to keep them ready for action in case he wanted to take some spontaneous shots. The second thing I noticed was that Marcus had an unusual sleep schedule. He claimed to work normal business hours, but I often heard him moving around the apartment late at night and early in the morning. Sometimes I'd wake up to the sound of him rearranging his cameras or what sounded like him taking photos, complete with the distinctive click and whir of old camera mechanisms. One morning, I woke up earlier than usual and decided to grab some coffee before Marcus got up. As I walked past his slightly open bedroom door, I glimpsed inside and saw something that made my blood run cold. The walls of his room were covered with photographs, but they weren't artistic shots or family pictures. They were all photos of people sleeping. I only saw them for a second before quickly moving past his door, but the images were burned into my mind. There had to be hundreds of photos pinned to his walls, all showing different people in various bedrooms, completely unconscious and vulnerable. Some looked like they had been taken from inside the room, while others seemed to be shot through windows. I tried to convince myself that maybe Marcus was working on some kind of art project or photography series about sleep, but deep down I knew something was very wrong. I started paying more attention to his behavior, and noticed that he often left the apartment late at night with a camera bag slung over his shoulder. A few weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange clicking sound. At first I thought it might be the radiator, or some other apartment noise, but as I listened more carefully, I recognized it as the sound of a camera shutter. It was coming from somewhere very close to my room. I lay in bed frozen with fear, listening to the rhythmic clicking that continued for several minutes before finally stopping. The next morning, I checked the hallway and found nothing unusual, but I noticed that one of Marcus's cameras that usually sat on the living room shelf was missing. My suspicions were confirmed when I came home early from work one day and found Marcus in the living room, carefully examining a stack of freshly developed photographs. When he heard me come in, he quickly shoved the photos into a manila envelope and acted like nothing had happened, but not before I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be pictures of someone sleeping in a bed that looked remarkably similar to mine. I knew I had to get out of there, but I was still several months away from the end of our lease, and I couldn't afford to break it. I started sleeping with a chair propped against my bedroom door, and kept my curtains tightly closed at all times. I also began varying my sleep schedule, hoping to make it harder for Marcus to predict when I'd be unconscious. The situation reached a breaking point when I discovered a small hole in the wall between our bedrooms. It was perfectly round and about the size of a camera lens, hidden behind a picture frame on Marcus's side. I realized he had been photographing me while I slept, probably for months. Confronting him directly seemed dangerous, so I decided to gather evidence first. I set up my phone to record my room while I pretended to sleep, hoping to catch him in the act. Sure enough, around 2 a.m., I heard the familiar clicking sounds, and my phone captured the faint glow of a camera flash coming through the hole in the wall. The next day, while Marcus was at work, I called the police and showed them the evidence. They were very interested in Marcus's photography collection and obtained a warrant to search the apartment. What they found was even worse than I had imagined. Marcus had been breaking into apartments and houses throughout the city for years, taking photographs of people while they slept. He had detailed notes about his victims' schedules and routines, and some of the photos dated back over a decade. The police found evidence that he had been selling some of the images online to people with similar disturbing interests. They also discovered that Marcus had been using his IT job to hack into home security systems and smart cameras, giving him access to even more private moments in people's lives. His camera collection wasn't just a hobby. It was the tool he used to violate hundreds of people's privacy and sense of security. Marcus was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including breaking and entering, stalking, and invasion of privacy. During the investigation, dozens of other victims came forward with similar stories about strange noises at night and the feeling of being watched while they slept. I moved out immediately and had to undergo months of therapy to deal with the violation of my privacy and the knowledge that someone had been watching me at my most vulnerable moment. The worst part was realizing that I had been living with a predator for months, completely unaware of what was happening just a few feet away from where I slept every night. Even now, years later, I still have trouble sleeping and always check for hidden cameras wherever I stay. The thought that Marcus might have shared those photos of me with other people continues to haunt me, and I'll never feel completely safe in my own bedroom again. Story 3. The Substitute. I'll never forget the day my roommate Jake introduced me to his cousin Tom. Jake had been acting strange for about a week, staying in his room most of the time and barely eating anything. When I asked if he was feeling okay, he just said he was going through some personal stuff and needed space. Then one evening, Jake brought Tom home and said he'd be staying with us for a few days while he looked for his own place. Tom seemed nice enough, though there was something unsettling about how much he and Jake looked alike. They had the same height, build, and even similar facial features, though Tom's hair was a bit longer and he wore glasses. We get that a lot, Tom laughed when I mentioned the resemblance. People always think we're brothers instead of cousins. Over the next few days, I noticed that Tom seemed to know a lot about Jake's life and routines. He knew where Jake kept his coffee, which TV shows he liked, and even seemed familiar with Jake's work schedule. When I commented on it, Tom explained that he and Jake had always been close and had spent a lot of time together growing up. What struck me as odd was how Jake started spending even less time in the common areas once Tom arrived. I'd hear them talking in Jake's room for hours, sometimes in voices so similar I couldn't tell who was speaking. Jake also stopped going to work, claiming he had taken some vacation days to help Tom get settled. After Tom had been staying with us for about a week, I woke up one morning to find him making breakfast in the kitchen. He was wearing Jake's clothes and had cut his hair to match Jake's exact style. When I asked where Jake was, Tom said he had left early for work, but something felt wrong about the whole situation. Tom's mannerisms were different from what I remembered about Jake, more nervous and hesitant. And when I looked closely, I noticed his eyes were a slightly different shade of brown than Jake. That evening, I decided to call Jake's workplace to see if he was okay. His supervisor told me that Jake hadn't shown up for work in over a week and hadn't called in sick or requested time off. When I confronted Tom about this, he became defensive and claimed there must have been some miscommunication. Jake's been really stressed lately, Tom said. Maybe he forgot to properly arrange his time off. Over the next few days, I began paying closer attention to Tom's behavior. He seemed to be studying everything about our apartment and my routines. I'd catch him going through Jake's mail and personal belongings when he thought I wasn't looking. He also started asking me detailed questions about Jake's friends, family, and work colleagues. The breaking point came when I found Tom practicing Jake's signature in a notebook. When I asked him about it, he claimed he was just doodling and that it was a coincidence the scribbles looked like Jake's name. But I knew what I had seen. That night, I decided to search Jake's room while Tom was out. What I found made my blood run cold. Hidden under Jake's mattress was a stack of documents with Tom's real name, which wasn't Tom at all. His actual name was David Chen, and the papers showed he had recently been released from a psychiatric facility where he had been treated for identity disorders and stalking behavior. Among the papers was a detailed plan outlining how David intended to gradually take over Jake's life. He had been studying Jake for months, learning his habits, his relationships, and his daily routines. The plan included steps for isolating Jake from his friends and family, taking over his job, and eventually assuming his complete identity. I also found Jake's phone, wallet, and keys hidden in a shoebox, along with what looked like medication that Jake took for anxiety. There was a note in David's handwriting that read, "Phase 1 complete." Jay becoming more compliant, ready for terrified. I immediately called the police, but when they arrived, David was gone. They found evidence of a struggle in Jake's room, including blood stains on the carpet that had been partially cleaned. The officers told me that David had a history of identity theft and had previously attempted to assume other people's identities after befriending them. The search for Jake lasted several weeks. Police discovered that David had been gradually poisoning Jake with overdoses of his own anxiety medication, keeping him weak and confused while he studied his mannerisms and relationships. David had also been intercepting Jake's mail and phone calls, isolating him from the outside world. Jake was eventually found locked in a storage unit across town, severely malnourished and dehydrated, but alive. David had been keeping him there while he practiced being Jake in our apartment. The plan was apparently to eventually kill Jake and completely take over his life, including his job, his relationships, and even his apartment. David was arrested and charged with kidnapping, attempted murder, and identity theft. During his trial, it came out that he had successfully pulled off similar schemes with at least 2 other victims over the past decade. One of those victims had never been found. Jake recovered physically, but the psychological trauma of having someone study and attempt to steal his entire identity left him deeply shaken. He moved back home with his family, and I never saw him again after the trial. The most disturbing part of the whole experience was realizing how easily David had fooled me initially. He had studied Jake so thoroughly that he could mimic his basic mannerisms and speech patterns well enough to pass casual observation. If I hadn't noticed the small inconsistencies and followed my instincts, David might have succeeded in his horrifying plan. I still have nightmares about finding David practicing Jake's signature and the cold, calculating way he had mapped out every detail of taking over another person's life. The thought that someone could be that obsessed with becoming someone else, to the point of being willing to kill for it, continues to haunt me years later. Story 4. The Whisperer. Living with Emma seemed like a dream come true at first. She was a graduate student in psychology, quiet and studious, and she kept the apartment spotless. We had similar schedules and got along well during our first few months as roommates. She was working on her thesis about sleep disorders and often stayed up late reading research papers. The first sign that something was off came about 4 months into our living arrangement. I started having incredibly vivid and disturbing dreams, much more intense than anything I had experienced before. They were always the same type. Someone was whispering to me in the darkness, telling me things about my life that I had never told anyone. In these dreams, the voice would reveal my deepest fears and insecurities, things I had buried so deep I barely acknowledged them myself. The voice knew about my childhood trauma, my relationship failures, and my professional anxiety. It spoke in a gentle, almost hypnotic tone that made the experience feel both terrifying and strangely intimate. I mentioned the dreams to Emma, thinking she might have some insight given her psychology background. She seemed very interested and asked detailed questions about the content and frequency of the dreams. She suggested I keep a dream journal and even offered to help me analyze the patterns. Dreams can tell us a lot about our subconscious fears, she said with a knowing smile. Sometimes our minds use sleep as a way to process things we can't face while awake. The dreams continued and actually seemed to intensify after I started the journal. Emma would often ask to read my entries, claiming it would help her understand what might be causing that. I was hesitant at first, but she convinced me it would be therapeutic to share them with someone who could offer professional insight. What I didn't realize at the time was that Emma was using the information from my dream journal to make the whispered suggestions more specific and personal. She had access to my deepest vulnerabilities, and she was weaponizing them against me in ways I couldn't understand. The dreams began affecting my waking life. I became increasingly anxious and paranoid, constantly feeling like someone was watching me or talking about me behind my back. I started having trouble concentrating at work and began isolating myself from friends and family. Emma was very supportive during this difficult time, often staying up late to talk me through my anxiety attacks. "You're going through a rough patch," she would say soothingly, "but I'm here for you. You can trust me with anything." It wasn't until I woke up one night around 3 a.m. that I discovered what was really happening. I had fallen asleep on the couch while studying, and as I slowly regained consciousness, I heard a familiar voice speaking very softly near my ear. It was Emma, whispering the same types of disturbing suggestions that had been plaguing my dreams for months. She was kneeling beside the couch, speaking in that hypnotic tone I knew so well, telling me that I was worthless, that nobody really cared about me, and that I should be ashamed of my past mistake. I lay completely still, pretending to be asleep, as she continued her psychological assault for nearly an hour. When she finally returned to her room, I was left shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. I realized that Emma had been psychologically manipulating me for months, using her knowledge of psychology and my personal vulnerabilities to systematically break down my mental health. The next day, I confronted her about what I had witnessed. Emma denied everything and suggested that I was having a psychotic break, possibly triggered by the stress I had been under. She spoke with such calm authority that I almost started doubting my own experience. "Sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations," she said with apparent concern. "Maybe you should see a doctor about these episodes you're having." But I knew what I had seen and heard. I started doing research into psychological manipulation techniques and discovered that what Emma had been doing was a form of gaslighting, combined with sleep suggestion, designed to make me question my own reality and become increasingly dependent on her support. I decided to gather evidence before making any accusations. I set up a hidden camera in the living room and started sleeping on the couch regularly, pretending to have insomnia. Sure enough, Emma would emerge from her room in the middle of the night and begin her whispered psychological attacks while she thought I was unconscious. The footage was disturbing to watch. Emma would kneel beside me for hours sometimes, systematically destroying my self-esteem and mental health with carefully crafted suggestions designed to increase my anxiety and depression. She would tell me that I was losing my mind, that I couldn't trust my own perceptions, and that she was the only person who truly understood what I was going through. What made it even more sinister was how she would comfort me the next day, when I inevitably felt worse, positioning herself as my savior while simultaneously being the source of my torment. She was creating a cycle of psychological abuse that made me increasingly dependent on her while destroying my ability to trust myself. When I had enough evidence, I went to the police, but they weren't sure what charges could be filed since Emma hadn't physically harmed me or threatened violence. They suggested I get a restraining order and move out immediately, which I did. I also discovered that I wasn't Emma's first victim. After I reported her behavior to the university, they launched an investigation and found that she had been using similar techniques on previous roommates and even some of her research subjects. She had been conducting unauthorized psychological experiments on people without their consent, treating them as lab rats for her twisted research. Emma was expelled from the graduate program and faced multiple ethics violations, though she never faced serious criminal charges for what she did to me and others. The psychological damage, however, took months of therapy to undo. The most disturbing aspect of the whole experience was realizing how vulnerable we are when we sleep, and how someone with knowledge of psychology can exploit that vulnerability to cause serious harm. Emma had turned my own mind against me, using my dreams and subconscious as weapons to slowly destroy my mental health from the inside out. Even now I have trouble sleeping deeply, and always feel anxious when I have to sleep in unfamiliar places. The knowledge that someone spent months whispering poison into my ears while I was helpless has left me with a lasting sense of violation that therapy has helped but never fully healed. Story 5. The Mimic. I thought I was getting lucky when I found a roommate through a mutual friend. Alex seemed perfect. Same age, similar interests, and most importantly, they could afford their half of the rent in our expensive city. We hit it off immediately and decided to move in together within a week of meeting. The first few months were great. Alex was funny, outgoing, and easy to live with. We became fast friends, hanging out regularly, and even dating some of the same people in our social circle. Alex had this amazing ability to get along with everyone and seemed to effortlessly fit into any group or situation. Looking back, I should have been suspicious of how quickly Alex adapted to different social environments. Whether we were at a dive bar with my college friends or a fancy dinner party with my work colleagues, Alex always seemed to know exactly how to act, what to say, and even how to dress for the occasion. The first hint that something was wrong came when my friend Sarah mentioned that Alex had told her a story that sounded exactly like something that had happened to me. When I asked Alex about it, they laughed it off and said we must have had similar experiences growing up. But I knew the story Sarah had repeated was uniquely mine. It involved a very specific incident from my childhood that I had only shared with a few people. Over the next few weeks, I started paying more attention to Alex's stories and realized that many of them were actually my stories, but with small details changed to make them seem like they had happened to Alex instead. They had taken my childhood memories, my family anecdotes, and even my work experiences and woven them into their own personal narrative. What made it even more disturbing was how good Alex was at selling these stolen stories. They would tell them with such conviction and emotion that even I sometimes questioned whether I was remembering correctly. Alex had somehow internalized my experiences so completely that they genuinely seemed to believe they had lived through them. The situation escalated when I noticed Alex starting to adopt my mannerisms, speech patterns, and even my taste in clothes. They would use phrases I commonly used, laugh the same way I did, and even started styling their hair similarly to mine. When I pointed this out, Alex became defensive and accused me of being narcissistic for thinking they were copying me. Maybe we're just naturally compatible, Alex said with that charming smile that had drawn me to them initially. Isn't it nice that we have so much in common? But it went beyond having things in common. Alex was systematically absorbing aspects of my personality and making them their own. They started wearing my cologne, eating the same foods I liked, and even began expressing interest in hobbies I had mentioned wanting to try. The breaking point came when I overheard Alex talking to someone on the phone, telling them about their childhood dog named Buster. Buster had been my dog, and the story Alex was telling was about something that had happened when I was 12 years old. They were describing my memories with such detail and emotion that it felt like they were stealing pieces of my soul. I confronted Alex that night, demanding to know why they were claiming my experiences as their own. Their reaction was unlike anything I had ever seen. Alex didn't deny it or try to explain it away. Instead, they became angry and accused me of being possessive of memories that weren't even that unique. Lots of people have similar childhoods, Alex said coldly. You don't own these experiences just because they happened to you. That's when I realized that Alex genuinely didn't see anything wrong with what they were doing. To them, my memories and experiences were just raw material to be harvested and repurposed for their own use. They had been systematically stealing my identity, piece by piece, until the line between us had become completely blurred. I started doing some research into Alex's background and discovered some disturbing patterns. They had very few photos from their childhood and became evasive whenever I asked specific questions about their past. When I managed to track down someone who had known Alex in high school, they described a completely different person with different interests and personality traits. It became clear that Alex had been doing this for years, moving from relationship to relationship and friendship to friendship, absorbing pieces of other people's identities and incorporating them into their own constantly evolving persona. They were like a psychological chameleon, but instead of just adapting to their environment, they were consuming it. The most frightening realization was that Alex seemed to have no stable sense of self. They were a collection of stolen experiences, borrowed mannerisms, and adopted interests, all held together by a desperate need to be someone, anyone, other than whoever they really were underneath it all. When I tried to distance myself from Alex, they became increasingly unstable. They would follow me to social events uninvited, contact my friends and family claiming to be worried about me, and even started showing up at my workplace. They were terrified of losing access to me because I was their primary source of new material to steal. The situation became dangerous when Alex started telling people that I was the one copying them. They claimed that I was jealous of their personality and was trying to steal their identity. They were so convincing that some of our mutual friends began to question what was really happening. I eventually had to get a restraining order when Alex broke into our apartment while I was at work and destroyed all of my photo albums and personal mementos. They left a note saying that if they couldn't have my memories, then I shouldn't be able to have them either. Alex disappeared after that, but I later learned that they had moved to another city and begun the same process with a new roommate. I tried to warn their new victim, but Alex had already poisoned them against me by claiming I was a stalker who was obsessed with them. The experience left me deeply shaken and questioning my own sense of identity. Alex had stolen so many of my stories and mannerisms that I sometimes felt like I didn't know who I was anymore. It took months of therapy to rebuild my sense of self and learn to trust my own memories again. The most disturbing part was realizing that there are people who exist as psychological parasites, feeding off others' identities because they have no authentic self of their own. Alex wasn't just copying me, they were consuming me, leaving me feeling hollow and questioning the authenticity of my own experiences. I still wonder sometimes who Alex really was underneath all the stolen pieces of other people's lives. But I'm not sure there was anyone there at all. Just an empty void desperately trying to fill itself with borrowed humanity. Story 6. The Watcher. When I moved in with Daniel, I thought I had found the perfect roommate. He was a freelance graphic designer who worked from home, which meant someone was always around to accept packages and keep an eye on the apartment. He was quiet, paid his bills on time, and seemed to respect personal boundaries. Daniel had converted the spare bedroom into a home office filled with multiple computer monitors, cameras, and other tech equipment. He explained that he did a lot of digital art and sometimes worked with video projects, which required the elaborate setup. I didn't think much of it at the time. Lots of creative professionals have expensive equipment. The first few months of living together were perfectly normal. Daniel kept to his schedule of working during the day and relaxing in the evenings. We'd occasionally chat about our days or watch TV together, but mostly we respected each other's space and privacy. The first strange thing I noticed was that Daniel seemed to know a lot about my daily routines without me ever telling him. He'd casually mention things like how I always grabbed coffee from the same place on Tuesday mornings, or how I usually got home from the gym around 7 p.m. on weekends. When I asked how he knew these details, he'd shrug and say he was just observant. I also started noticing that Daniel had an unusual interest in my social life. He'd ask detailed questions about where I was going when I left the apartment, who I was meeting, and what time I expected to be back. He framed it as being a good roommate and wanting to know when to expect me home, but the level of detail he wanted felt invasive. What really started to worry me was Daniel's knowledge of my work schedule and personal appointment. He'd mentioned that I had seemed stressed about a meeting I had never told him about, or ask how a doctor's appointment went when I was certain I hadn't mentioned having one. When I questioned him about it, he'd act confused and claim I must have mentioned it in passing. One evening, I came home earlier than usual and heard Daniel talking to someone in his office. As I passed by his slightly open door, I could hear him describing what sounded like my daily activities in great detail. He was telling someone about my morning routine, my work habits, and even personal details about my relationships. When I knocked on his door to see who he was talking to, Daniel quickly ended the call and claimed he had been on a work conference, but something about his nervous demeanor and the speed with which he had hung up made me suspicious. I started paying more attention to Daniel's behavior and noticed that he always seemed to be at his computer when I left the apartment, and when I returned, he'd often make comments about things happening in the neighborhood that suggested he had been watching the street from his window for extended periods. The situation became more concerning when I realized that Daniel somehow knew about private conversations I'd had on the phone in my own room. He'd make subtle references to things I had discussed with friends and family, details that he couldn't possibly have overheard from the common areas of our apartment. One night I decided to test my suspicion. I had a fake phone conversation in my room about planning to visit my parents the following weekend, a trip I had no intention of taking. The next morning, Daniel casually asked if I was excited about my upcoming trip to see my parents. That's when I knew for certain that Daniel was somehow listening in on my private conversations. I started searching my room for hidden microphones or cameras but couldn't find anything obvious. However, I did notice that the air vent in my bedroom wall seemed to have been tampered with recently. I decided to investigate Daniel's office while he was out running errands. What I found there was absolutely horrifying. Daniel had multiple monitors displaying what appeared to be surveillance footage from hidden cameras throughout our apartment. I could see feeds from my bedroom, the bathroom, and even inside my car. But that wasn't the worst part. Daniel had detailed files on his computer containing months of recorded conversations, photos of me in private moments, and logs of my daily activities going back to when I first moved in. He had been systematically spying on every aspect of my life and documenting it all. I also discovered that Daniel wasn't just watching me for his own sick entertainment. He had been selling access to the surveillance footage and personal information to other people online. There were chat logs showing him discussing my schedule and habits with strangers who seemed to have a disturbing interest in my personal life. Even more terrifying was evidence that Daniel had been using the information he gathered to manipulate situations in my life. He had contacted people I knew, pretending to be a friend or colleague, and had been spreading rumors and false information designed to isolate me socially. I realized that Daniel had been orchestrating problems in my relationships and friendships, then positioning himself as a supportive roommate who was always there when I needed someone to talk to. He was systematically destroying my support network while making himself seem indispensable. I immediately called the police and showed them the evidence I had found. They were shocked by the extent of Daniel's surveillance operation and arrested him on multiple charges, including invasion of privacy, stalking, and fraud. The investigation revealed that he had been running similar operations on previous roommates for years. Daniel had perfected a system of psychological manipulation combined with high-tech surveillance to control and exploit the people he lived with. He would gradually isolate his victims from their friends and family, while gathering compromising information that he could use to blackmail or manipulate them. The police found evidence that Daniel had driven at least 2 previous roommates to nervous breakdowns through his systematic psychological abuse. He had been careful to never leave physical evidence of his manipulation, making it nearly impossible for his victims to prove what was happening to them. During the investigation, they discovered that Daniel was part of a larger network of people who shared techniques and even traded access to their surveillance victims. It was an organized community of predators who treated the people they lived with as entertainment and sources of income. The violation of privacy was bad enough, but the psychological manipulation was what really damaged me long term. Daniel had been playing puppet master with my life for months, engineering situations and relationships to suit his own twisted purpose. Even after Daniel was arrested and convicted, I struggled with paranoia and trust issues for years. I would constantly check for hidden cameras and microphones in every new place I lived. The knowledge that someone had been watching my most private moments and using that information to manipulate my life left me feeling violated in ways I'm still processing. The most disturbing part was learning that Daniel genuinely believed he was helping me by managing my relationships and social interactions. In his twisted mind, he was protecting me from people who might hurt me by driving them away from. He saw himself as a guardian rather than a predator, which made his actions even more chilling. I moved out immediately after his arrest and have never lived with a roommate. The experience taught me that privacy is something we often take for granted until it's completely destroyed by someone we trusted. Daniel didn't just invade my physical space. He invaded my entire life and turned it into his personal entertainment system. Story 7: The Sleepwalker's Secret. When I answered Lisa's ad for a roommate, she mentioned that she was a sleepwalker and asked if I'd be okay with occasionally finding her wandering around the apartment at night. She seemed embarrassed about it and explained that it was a condition she'd had since childhood. She assured me that she was harmless and usually just walked around for a few minutes before returning to bed. I didn't think it would be a big deal. My younger brother had been a sleepwalker when we were kids, so I was familiar with the condition. Lisa seemed like a great roommate otherwise. She was a nurse at the local children's hospital, had excellent references, and was offering to pay more than her fair share of the rent. The first few times I encountered Lisa sleepwalking, it was exactly what I expected. I'd find her standing in the hallway, or slowly walking through the living room with her eyes open, but completely vacant. She'd respond to gentle guidance back to her room, and would have no memory of it the next morning. After about a month of living together, I noticed that Lisa's sleepwalking episodes were becoming more frequent and seemed to be lasting longer. Instead of just wandering aimlessly, she appeared to be performing specific tasks. I'd find her in the kitchen opening and closing cabinets, or in the living room moving furniture around. One night, I woke up to the sound of running water and found Lisa in the bathroom, washing her hands obsessively. She scrubbed them over and over for nearly 20 minutes, occasionally muttering something under her breath that I couldn't make out. When I tried to guide her back to bed, she resisted and continued washing. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to Lisa, expecting her usual embarrassed apology and assurance that she'd talk to her doctor about adjusting her medication. Instead, she became defensive and claimed it never happened. When I insisted that I had witnessed it, she accused me of trying to make her feel bad about her medical condition. This was the first time Lisa had ever denied one of her sleepwalking episodes, and her aggressive reaction made me suspicious. I started paying closer attention to her nighttime activities and began to notice some disturbing patterns. Lisa's sleepwalking episodes always seemed to coincide with nights when she had worked at the hospital. She'd come home appearing normal, but a few hours after going to bed, she'd begin her nocturnal wandering. What troubled me was that her movements seemed too purposeful and organized for someone who was truly unconscious. One night, I followed Lisa as she sleepwalked into the kitchen and watched in horror as she began methodically going through our trash, examining every piece of discarded mail and personal documents. She spent over an hour carefully reading through bank statements, medical bills, and other sensitive information that I had thrown away. When she was finished, Lisa carefully put everything back exactly where she had found it and returned to her room. The whole time, her movements were deliberate and focused, nothing like the confused, aimless wandering I had observed in other sleepwalkers. I realized that Lisa was using her supposed sleepwalking condition as cover to snoop through my personal belongings and private information. She had been systematically violating my privacy for months, while I dismissed her behavior as a harmless medical condition. The next day, I set up a hidden camera in the living room to document what Lisa was really doing during her sleepwalking episode. What I captured was even worse than I had suspected. Lisa wasn't just going through my trash. She was photographing important documents with her phone, copying down account numbers and passwords, and even going through my purse and wallet. The footage showed that Lisa was completely alert and aware during these nighttime activities. She would carefully listen at my bedroom door to make sure I was asleep before beginning her surveillance. She was methodical and thorough, spending hours each night gathering information about my finances, work, and personal life. I also discovered that Lisa had been entering my bedroom while I slept, going through my dresser drawers and desk, and even using my computer. She had somehow figured out my passwords and had been accessing my email accounts, social media profiles, and online banking. When I confronted Lisa with the video evidence, she initially tried to maintain the sleepwalking charade, claiming she had no control over her actions and was horrified to learn what she had been doing. But when I pointed out specific details that proved she was fully conscious, she finally dropped the act. Lisa's real personality was completely different from the sweet, apologetic nurse I thought I knew. She became cold and calculating, explaining that she had been gathering information about me because she needed to make sure I was trustworthy enough to live with her. "You never know who people really are," she said with chilling calmness. "I have to protect myself and my interests." I discovered that Lisa had been using my personal information to monitor my financial situation, track my relationships, and even interfere with aspects of my life without my knowledge. She had contacted my employer pretending to be a concerned friend when I had called in sick, and had even reached out to my family members with fake emergencies to gather more information about my background. Lisa had also been using my identity for small financial frauds, opening credit cards in my name and making purchases that she then carefully paid off to avoid detection. She had been essentially living a double life funded by my stolen identity while maintaining her facade as a caring medical professional. The most disturbing revelation was that Lisa had done this to multiple previous roommates. She had perfected her sleepwalking act over years, using it to gain access to other people's most private information. She viewed roommates as resources to be exploited rather than people deserving of trust and respect. When I reported Lisa to the police, they found evidence of identity theft, fraud, and invasion of privacy dating back several years. Her nursing license was revoked when the hospital discovered she had been using the same techniques to access patient information and steal from her colleagues. Lisa was eventually sentenced to several years in prison, but the damage to my credit and personal life took much longer to repair. I had to close all of my bank accounts, change all of my passwords, and spend months dealing with fraudulent charges and accounts that had been opened in my name. The experience taught me to never ignore my instincts when something feels wrong, even when there seems to be an innocent explanation. Lisa had weaponized my sympathy and understanding about her supposed medical condition to commit serious crimes against me and others. I still have trouble trusting roommates or anyone who has access to my living space. The knowledge that someone spent months systematically violating my privacy while I slept peacefully nearby continues to haunt me. Lisa didn't just steal my information, she stole my sense of security and safety in my own home. Story 8. The perfect match. Finding the perfect roommate through an online matching service seemed too good to be true. And as it turned out, it was. The service claimed to use advanced algorithms to match compatible people based on detailed personality profiles, lifestyle preferences, and living habits. When they paired me with Rachel, the compatibility score was supposedly 98%. Rachel seemed amazing on paper and even better in person. She was clean, quiet, financially responsible, and shared many of my interests, including yoga, cooking, and true crime podcasts. We had similar work schedules, the same taste in TV shows, and even liked the same obscure bands. It felt like meeting a long-lost sister. The apartment hunting process was effortless. Rachel and I agreed on everything: the neighborhood we wanted, our budget range, and what amenities were important to us. When we found our perfect two-bedroom apartment, we both knew immediately that it was the one. The landlord was so impressed with how well we got along that he approved our application on the spot. Living with Rachel was initially everything I had hoped for. She was considerate, fun to be around, and we quickly became close friends. We'd cook dinner together, binge-watch shows, and spend hours talking about everything from work drama to dating disasters. I felt incredibly lucky to have found not just a good roommate, but a genuine best friend. The first sign that something was off came about 3 months into our lease. I mentioned that I was thinking about switching to a new gym because mine was getting too crowded. The next day, Rachel casually mentioned that she had been thinking the exact same thing and had actually visited the same gym I was considering. At first, this seemed like another example of our amazing compatibility. But as time went on, I started noticing that Rachel's preferences and opinions seemed to shift to match mine almost immediately after I expressed them. If I mentioned liking a new restaurant, Rachel would suddenly develop a craving for that type of food. If I complained about something, Rachel would echo the same complaint with almost identical wording. What made it even stranger was that Rachel seemed to have no strong preferences of her own. When I asked her to choose a movie or restaurant, she'd always defer to my preferences or suggest something she knew I liked. She appeared to be the most agreeable person I'd ever met, but in a way that started to feel unsettling rather than harmonious. I began testing my suspicions by expressing interest in random things to see if Rachel would suddenly develop the same interests. Sure enough, when I mentioned thinking about taking up rock climbing, Rachel signed up for a climbing class the same week. When I said I was considering getting a cat, Rachel started researching pet adoption agencies. The situation became truly disturbing when I realized that Rachel was not only copying my preferences, but also my mannerisms, speech patterns, and even my style choices. She started wearing similar clothes to mine, using phrases I commonly used, and even began styling her hair in a way that made us look more alike. I started to feel like I was living with a mirror that was slowly trying to replace me. Rachel had no apparent personality or identity of her own. She existed only as a reflection of whoever she was living with at the time. My suspicions were confirmed when I discovered that Rachel had been lying about her background from the very beginning. The stories she told about her childhood, her family, and her past experiences were all fabricated. When I tried to verify details about her life, I found that almost nothing she had told me was true. I also learned that the online roommate matching service that had paired us was actually operated by Rachel herself. She had created the entire elaborate system as a way to identify and target potential victims who were looking for compatible roommates. The detailed personality profiles weren't being used to find good matches. They were being used to help Rachel perfectly mimic whoever she chose to live with. Rachel had been studying my profile for weeks before we met, learning my preferences, my personality traits, and my lifestyle habit. When we finally connected, she already knew exactly how to present herself to seem like my ideal roommate and best friend. The fake matching service allowed Rachel to position herself as the perfect solution to my housing needs, while gathering extensive information about my personality, habits, and vulnerability. She had been targeting people who were new to the city, recently single, or otherwise in transitional periods when they might be more susceptible to manipulation. When I confronted Rachel with what I had discovered, her mask finally slipped completely. The warm, agreeable personality disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. She admitted that she had been using the fake roommate service to prey on lonely people for years, moving from victim to victim as she perfected her psychological manipulation technique. Rachel explained that she had no stable identity of her own, and existed by absorbing and reflecting other people's personalities back at them. She was like a psychological vampire, feeding off the identities of others, because she had no authentic self to draw from. What made her particularly dangerous was how skilled she had become at making her victims feel special and understood. By perfectly mirroring their interests and personalities, she created an intoxicating sense of connection that made people lower their guard and become emotionally dependent on her approval. I discovered that Rachel had been systematically isolating me from my other friendships and relationships by subtly undermining them. She would make small negative comments about my friends, suggest that they didn't really understand me the way she did, and position herself as the only person who truly got me. The police investigation revealed that Rachel had victimized dozens of people over the years, using various fake identity matching services. She would live with each victim for several months, gradually draining their bank accounts, stealing their personal information, and psychologically manipulating them until they were completely dependent on her. When she was finished with one victim, Rachel would disappear and reinvent herself for the next target, taking with her whatever money, possessions, or identity information she had managed to steal. She left behind a trail of confused and emotionally devastated people who struggled to understand what had happened to them. Rachel was eventually convicted of multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and psychological abuse, but the emotional damage she caused was much harder to quantify or repair. She had made each of her victims question their own judgment, their ability to form genuine relationships, and even their sense of self. The experience taught me that sometimes the people who seem most compatible with us are actually the most dangerous. Rachel had used my own personality and preferences as weapons against me, turning my desire for connection and understanding into a trap that nearly destroyed my sense of identity. I still struggle with trusting new people and often question whether someone's interest in me is genuine or if they're just reflecting my own personality back at me. The knowledge that someone can be so skilled at psychological manipulation that they can make you fall in love with your own reflection continues to haunt my relationships to this day.